Nature's Archive Podcast, a Jumpstart Nature production.
And there's insects flying everywhere, pollinators, predators. Yeah, there's a few pest insects, but the predators are keeping them in check. You have to have that diversity to make things function.
I've been really lucky to have some amazing guests on Nature's Archive. Guests who have opened my eyes and hopefully opened yours as well to new ways of seeing nature. Today's guest opens our eyes to agricultural practices that work in harmony with our ecosystems. Why is this important? Well, by some estimates, as much as 44% of the land in the United States is used for some form of agriculture, and the principles of regenerative agriculture serve as a primer for understanding important aspects of soil health and the carbon and nitrogen cycles. If you want to support biodiversity, this is a great episode. Our guest and guide today is Gabe Brown, author of Dirt to Soil, One Family's Journey into Regenerative Agriculture, which, by the way, has 1,500 Amazon reviews and not a single one is below 3 stars. It's hard to find a profile like that. Gabe has been called a pioneer of the soil health movement, and his personal story of migrating his 5,000-acre property to regenerative practices is both inspiring and a great educational tool. Today we discuss Gabe's story and dig into the 6 principles of soil health and how they drive 4 different ecosystem processes. We discuss the impacts of soil disturbance on soil biology, the importance of fungi and microorganisms, nitrogen fixing, and much more. Gabe's also working to spread regenerative farming to more people, and he's working to make it easier for consumers to locate and purchase foods grown with regenerative practices. We talk a bit about that, and also how you can even apply these practices to your own garden. And you can find more about Gabe and his work at understandingag.com and soilhealthacademy.org. So without further delay, Gabe Brown. Gabe, thank you so much for joining me on Nature's Archive today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you.
I am looking forward to this for a lot of different reasons. And one, we were just talking a little bit here before pressing the record button. And today we're going to be talking about a specific type of agricultural practice that you've been a proponent of. And I think a lot of environmental advocates get so used to hearing the term agriculture in a negative context, like it might be big ag or factory farming or intensive grazing or things that are very extreme on one side of a spectrum. And of course, we all need to eat, and the work of farmers is never ending and unforgiving. So in looking at your work, it seems like you've charted a path for farmers and gardeners to work with nature rather than against it. That's much more balanced, I think, than what a lot of environmental advocates might conjure up when they think of this. So it really sounds like a win-win for everyone.
That's right, Michael. We like to use the phrase regenerative agriculture, and in our mind, that's simply what regenerative agriculture is. It's working in harmony and synchrony with nature. And I think agriculture as a whole has tended to move away from that. Instead, it's become one where mankind is trying to impose his or her will on nature. And I think we have to get back to those natural principles of how ecosystems function. And if we do that, it's much more profitable for the farmer and rancher, much better for the environment and the ecosystem, and we produce food that's higher in nutrient density. So it's a win-win-win situation.
And I want to hear about how you first engaged with these concepts, but maybe even backing up another couple of steps. Have you always had this sort of ecosystem awareness in your life as a kid even?
No, I wish, but my story is I grew up in the city of Bismarck, North Dakota, grew up in town, was not involved directly in agriculture, but I tell people I have the good fortune that when I was a freshman in high school, I took a vocational agriculture course, and I was immediately enthralled with all agriculture. I just knew that was my calling and passion, and it's what I wanted to do. I started working on farms and ranches during high school. I went to college to be a vocational ag educator because not being from a farm or ranch, I didn't think that there was a way for me to get into production agriculture. But then, as luck would have it, I married my high school sweetheart, and she grew up on a farm, and her parents asked if we'd be interested in coming back and taking over the farm. And I guess the rest is history, so to speak.
Let's dig into that history a little bit. So you took over this farm, and what was the state of it when you first took it over? And what challenges did you face?
Right. So I learned how to farm from my in-laws, and they were very quote unquote conventional. Heavy tillage, monoculture, small grain production, a lot of spring wheat, oats, barley. They had a small cow herd that was what we call set stocked. In other words, the animals were put in a pasture basically for the entire summer, and then in the winter they stayed in the corral. And that's how I learned to farm and ranch. One thing about me is I consider myself a lifelong learner. I love to read, and I can never learn enough. So I had studied and read about no-till farming. And we're in a semi-brittle environment here. We get approximately 17 or 18 inches of total precipitation a year, of which approximately 2/3 of that comes from rain, and the other third is from the 75 plus inches of snow we get every winter. So I thought that going no-till would be a way to conserve moisture and to save me time, because there's a lot of time and expense to going out and tilling the fields. And so if I went no-till, I could save money. So in 1991, we had the good fortune of being able to buy a part of the farm from my wife's parents. And after so doing, I had studied enough about no-till that 1994, we transitioned the entire ranch to no-till. I sold all my tillage equipment and I quit tilling. And the first year we had a very productive crop, profitable crop, and I thought this was easy. Okay, now I got it made. I learned how to no-till and it worked good. What happened after that was really a set of circumstances that chartered my course for the rest of my life. What happened in 1995, the day before we were going to start combining our 1,200 acres of spring wheat, we lost 100% of the crop in a hailstorm. So we went from what could have been a profitable crop to one that lost us considerable money. 1996 came along and we lost 100% of our crop to hail again. So, I wasn't able to pay the bank back the money I had borrowed to buy all the fertilizer and chemicals and everything that was needed to produce that crop. 1997 came along and we dried out. It was a major drought in the area and nobody combined harvested an acre that year. 1998 came along and we lost 80% of our crop to hail. So 4 years in a row, basically no production. Left my wife and I $1.5 million in debt. And we both took off-farm jobs and we had a young family at the time. And how am I going to dig my way out of this debt? The bank wasn't going to loan me any money anymore to purchase the inputs. But what happened during those 4 years is I started to observe things. Think of what happens when a hailstorm comes. It pounds down the crop onto the soil surface. That's protecting the soil. Also, what happens is it's armor on the soil surface, so it's protecting that soil from wind erosion, water erosion. After those first 2 years of hail, I started to notice earthworms. When my father-in-law and I had tilled the fields, there was no earthworms in the soil, because there was no home for them. The tillage destroyed it all. I noticed life returning to our ranch. I noticed more birds and deer and other wildlife showing up. And it really dawned on me that this is really how nature functions. Now, I'm not going to kid you, it's very difficult to go through, but I learned a lot of lessons along the way. For instance, after the hailstorm, I started planting what we call now today cover crops. I was really just trying to seed something to get feed for my livestock because the hailstorm had pounded all the forage into the ground. I was diversifying my crop rotation, and diversity is a key component of any healthy ecosystem. Also, because I couldn't afford to buy the twine or purchase the fuel to bale the hay, I grazed my livestock during the winter on those cover crops through the snow. I was learning how to integrate animals back onto the cropland. So I tell people those 4 years of natural disasters, although they were extremely difficult to go through, were absolutely the best thing that could have happened to my wife and I, because it taught me what's become known today as the 6 principles of soil health. And those 6 principles then drive the 4 ecosystem processes. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking my large cropland acres here in North Dakota or in a garden environment. It's the principles that drive the processes to give you a healthy soil ecosystem, and that's what cycles the nutrients and produces nutrient-dense plants, whether it be grains, fruits, or vegetables.
So I have a couple of questions or maybe some context to set. One thing, having grown up in Nebraska, I understand what a hailstorm is like in the Midwest. And a lot of my audience is in California. They may not understand this, but you're talking probably golf ball, baseball sized hail to destroy your crops like that.
Yeah, I literally replaced all the shingles on all of our farm buildings 3 out of 4 years.
Yeah.
And that's not a fun job to do.
I can imagine. And I've also been really interested in, we probably don't have a lot of time to go too deep into it, but the history of tilling. So first of all, why did tilling become such an established practice in the first place? What was the rationale, and how deep are you digging up the soil when you till?
Tilling goes back literally thousands of years. You can go back into the Middle East and see diagrams of people tilling. And tilling is a way to disturb the soil to allow seed to be planted. So that's what they did. Now, you think of in terms of the United States, this soil we had was very healthy and rich because it had been under a very diverse perennial plant community for thousands of years. That took massive amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and moved it into the soil ecosystem. And it's that carbon in the soil that acts like a sponge. It feeds biology, but then also it holds on to moisture. Think of what's happened when we've all seen pictures of the bonanza farms in the Great Plains in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you had all of these horses pulling these single bottom plows, and they were turning over that soil. And it was a very rich soil, high in carbon, high in humus, very productive because of the amount of carbon in it and because of the biology in the soil. And that's how our forefathers were able to produce an abundance of profitable crops for so many years. But what happened because of tillage? The Dust Bowl occurred. We eroded, we took that, what was once mat of vegetation of growing forages, plants, and we turned that under. Well, then it was bare soil exposed to the wind and the elements. Pretty soon we had the Dust Bowl. And I would contend, look what happened in the state of Illinois just 2 weeks ago. We had 7 deaths and over 100 cars in an accident because of a dust storm. And I was interviewed by a number of news media after that event, and I told them that the sad part is it was totally preventable. Because if those farmers would have been practicing no-till, if they would have been growing cover crops, holding that soil in place, those lives would have been spared and all that devastation would have been spared. We're actually seeing a second Dust Bowl occurring right now. And I've been in California many, many times, and we see the same thing there. The Central Valley of California is very eroded and degraded because of the current farming practices. So that's what tillage is causing. Tillage is also the reason, quite frankly, not the total reason, but a large part of the reason that we have so much carbon in the atmosphere, not in the soil where it belongs.
Right. That's a good overview, I think. And if someone is going no-till, this probably just is a lead in to the 6 principles of soil health, actually, because everything interrelates. It's a circular discussion in a way. But my understanding is that your machinery, your mechanisms change, and you're essentially drilling your seeds into the ground. Is that roughly accurate?
That's right. See, what tillage does, tillage more or less turns the soil upside down, so to speak, whether it be a plow or what's called a chisel plow, a cultivator, or for those gardeners, they use rototiller or a hoe to turn the soil upside down. What no-till does, it simply has a single disc. Just think of it as a very thin blade that slices through the residue. In other words, that plant material that's dying, decaying on the soil surface, it slices through there, and then the seed drops down into that little slice, and then there is another, we call it a firming wheel, that pushes that little bit of disturbed soil back over the seed to give it the seed soil contact it needs to germinate. You literally have to look very closely to see that the soil was disturbed at all.
Got it. That's a good visual. And so why don't we just jump in to the 6 tenets? And I guess what we've been talking about in a way is the first one, soil armor. So is there anything else you'd like to add? There probably is more context here, actually.
Yeah, and there's what's become known today as 6 principles of soil health. And the first one is context. Nature always acts in context with the environment. Here I am, I live in North Dakota, and I tell people there's a reason bananas don't grow in North Dakota. Okay, we have winter in North Dakota. We only have about 110 frost-free days a year. A banana is not going to survive here. There's a reason that the deer fawn in June in North Dakota. They don't want to drop their fawns in the middle of a blizzard in January in North Dakota, right? In agriculture and in gardening, ecosystems always function within the context of their environment, whether it be the temperatures, whether it be the moisture, the humidity. We have to work within the context of our environment. The second principle is least amount of mechanical, chemical disturbance possible. Yes, in nature, there's burrowing animals and earthworms and rodents that move the soil a little bit, but it's not this copious amount of tillage that we just talked about. We're not seeing acre after acre of bare soil. Nature does not go out and rototill the soil like many gardeners do. And also in nature, we don't see the copious amounts of these synthetics, whether it be fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides. Nature doesn't work that way. The third principle is armor on the soil surface. Where in nature do you see bare soil? Usually it's only where mankind's action have caused that to occur. Walk into a forested area, there's always a carpet of leaves and decaying plant material. Walk into a prairie, there's always plant material on the surface and growing plants. Nature always tries to keep that soil covered because it does not want it prone to wind erosion, water erosion, and it doesn't want the moisture to evaporate away. The fourth principle is that of diversity. Where in nature do you find monocultures? Again, only where mankind's actions have caused that to occur. Nature is very diverse. I'm a history buff, and reading Lewis and Clark's old journals, they recorded over 300 different plant species on their journey. Yet look at what we're doing in agriculture today. We see a monoculture field. And then we wonder why we have issues with disease or pests. It's because of our action. We don't have the diversity that's needed to house all the predator insects, etc. The fifth principle is that of a living root in the soil as long as possible throughout the year. Nature always tries to have a living plant because it wants to cycle that solar energy out of the atmosphere, take that carbon, and then through photosynthesis, it creates all these carbon compounds where a plant uses part of them for growth, and then it moves part of it down and passes it out through the roots, exudes it out into the soil to feed biology. That's how our soils got so much carbon in them. And the final principle is animal and insect integration. Natural ecosystems simply do not function properly without animals and insects. And this is one of the real issues we're seeing today. When we remove animals and insects from the environment, bad things happen, plain and simple. The beautiful thing about these 6 principles is I've traveled extensively all over the world, and you can put me on any land, mass in the world, with the exception of the Arctic and Antarctic. And even there, this occurs to some extent, unless it's under a polar ice cap for the entire year. These 6 principles will always be in effect in a healthy ecosystem.
Hey, nature enthusiast, do you want to be part of something bigger? Well, we're building a movement at Jumpstart Nature, and we've just added some new volunteers to help with our podcast and website. But this means our costs are going up too. I need to purchase software licenses to give them access to the production tools we use. For example, one media editing license costs $21 a month. And this is where you come in. Please consider supporting our mission by contributing to Jumpstart Nature through our Patreon or direct contributions, or even purchasing some logo merch. Check out all these options at jumpstartnature.com/donate, also linked in the show notes. Not ready to make a financial contribution? Then please share this episode with 3 friends. Sharing what we do is actually one of the very best ways you can help us. Thank you all for your continued support. The thing that popped into mind when you were talking about the monoculture aspect is, if you were to stick, say, like 30 people in a small room and one of them catches cold, most of the 30 are going to catch that cold. And we call those schools, by the way. Anyone who's had a kid has probably experienced this. And then, with monocultures, the introduction of a pest that is probably not native and can just run rampant is presumably a huge fear of farmers in that environment.
I would just use my own ranch here in North Dakota as an example. We have a 6,000-acre ranch, and I have not used an insecticide on this ranch in well over 20 years. I don't see a need to, because I have the diversity which provides the home and habitat for all the predator insects. Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, world-famous entomologist, told me once, for every insect species that's a pest, there's 1,700 species that are beneficial or indifferent. So why do we as mankind spend all of our time trying to kill that pest? Why don't we just provide the home and habitat for all those beneficials that would take care of that pest? See, I don't worry about a pest. Do I have pest insects on my ranch? Sure. But I need some to feed those beneficials, those predator insects, to keep the populations of the pests in check. We're just approaching it the wrong way as humans. In 1997, I heard a rancher speak who said something that really changed my life. He said, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. And when I started looking at my environment differently, looking at my ecosystem as a whole from an ecological context, this all becomes relatively simple. I don't have to worry about pest insects anymore. The predators will take care of them.
So let's continue down this thread for a moment, and then I want to circle back to maybe some of the other principles as well in a little bit more depth. How do you provide a home for all of these beneficial insects and animals that may be missing in an existing environment?
Very good question. Alan Savory told me once, he was here touring my ranch and made the comment to him about a weed. And he said, Gabe, once you start thinking of a plant as either good or bad, you've lost the battle. Because that plant is serving a purpose, whether you think it is or not. And he said, we have to allow nature to function in order for the betterment of the whole. And look at farming today, or let's bring this down to a garden. I tell people, although I'm more known as a farmer or rancher, I absolutely love to garden. And we have a couple of gardens on our farm here that have not been tilled now in close to 30 years. And when visitors come to our ranch, I like to take them to the garden first because I can show them everything in that small space. And in that garden, a lot of people plant their garden and they have these perfect rows of monocultures. Each part of the garden is segmented. No, you come to Gabe's and there'll be a row of corn and then a row of peas on one side and a row of beans on another, and then there's flowers, and there's squash crawling all up the corn, and it's a chaotic mess, but it's very healthy. And what strikes people is the diversity of it all. And there's insects flying everywhere, pollinators, predators. Yeah, there's a few pest insects, but the predators are keeping them in check. You have to have that diversity to make things function properly.
I know that part of choosing the plants that you want to grow to create this diversity also relates to nutrient cycling and soil health. Can you connect those dots for me?
The 6 principles of soil health drive the 4 ecosystem processes. And those 4 ecosystem processes are, number 1, the energy cycle. Plants take in that sunlight, as I mentioned earlier. That starts the energy cycle. You know, about 97% of what a plant needs to grow, it gets from the atmosphere. So many gardeners and farmers are worried about, oh, we got to fertilize, we got to apply what's needed for that plant. That's foolish thought. 97% of it is the energy cycle out of the atmosphere. What that does then, plants exude part of those compounds into the soil to feed biology. And it's biology, these biotic glues, along with glomalin for mycorrhizal fungi, that's the sticky substance that starts holding sand, silt, and clay particles together. One of the key principles that a gardener or a farmer need to know is how to build a soil aggregate. And I tell people, look at soil aggregates as marbles in a jar. If you have a jar full of marbles and you pour water on that, the water fills those pore spaces between the marbles. In soil, think of your aggregates as the same as a marble. But you need to understand that aggregate's going to only last approximately 4 weeks. And then biology is going to consume the glues that hold it together. So if you don't have living plants that are exuding those carbon compounds, feeding biology, you're not going to build new soil aggregates. No new soil aggregates, what happens? Your soil collapses. So often you hear gardeners say, I have to rototill the soil in order so it'll infiltrate water. No, rototilling the soil is making it worse. You're collapsing the soil even more. The reason you have a hard soil is you haven't built enough soil aggregates. You didn't have enough diversity of plant species growing to cycle that carbon to build aggregates. Those aggregates then help the water cycle. It helps for infiltration. Then you need to understand that biology in the soil lives in and on thin films of water in those pore spaces between soil aggregates. And it's the biology running its life cycle that provides the nutrients to the plant. On this ranch here in North Dakota, I have not applied a single pound of any nutrient since 2007. Yet I produce very profitable cash crops, produce very abundant garden with vegetables and fruit. How can I do that? Well, it's because I have the diversity and I have the life in the soil. Think of it this way. In a teaspoonful of healthy soil, there's more microorganisms than there are people on this planet. Yet how many of us as gardeners or farmers think of that? How many of us think about feeding that soil biology? Yet it's that soil biology then that brings the nutrients to the plant, allowing that plant to produce the phytonutrients, which is what feeds our gut microbiome. And we're involved in some really good research now being done by a team of scientists that's looking at the difference between vegetables, fruits, pastured proteins grown in and on healthy soil compared to that grown in a tilled unhealthy soil. And these scientists can measure well over 2,000 different phytonutrient compounds, and the differences are just mind-blowing. I contend that, and I'm getting off track here a little bit, but I contend that the majority of people really do not understand what nutrient-dense food tastes like. We no longer produce food, we produce food-like substances. It's truly not the nutrient-dense food that's full of all these different phytonutrients. So that all gets back to the 4 ecosystem processes: the energy cycle, the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and the fourth one is community dynamics or diversity. Those are the 4 processes that are driven by those 6 principles.
And I love that you mentioned the spoonful of soil and the number of organisms in it. I literally just had a social media post using that exact fact here, I think 2 days ago or something. And for listeners who are interested in the biology in soil and all these organisms, I'm just going to shout out an earlier episode. We had Dr. Elaine Ingham on, who's a soil biologist, I think would be.
She's a microbiologist. Yep.
So yeah, it was a good episode. Lots of deep dives into the various aspects. I'm really curious about the nutrient density aspect, and I've seen some of the studies that show the decline in nutritional availability in various products that we buy today. So what is going on in the soil that's allowing for your crops to be more nutrient dense?
So it can be traced back to one word: biodiversity. Realize that plants have the ability to send out different root exudates that attract different biology to bring them the nutrients they need. But you have to have a diverse array of plants in an ecosystem in order to have that happen. You might have 2 plants, and I'll just use this as an example. Say you have a corn plant growing, and then you have a pea plant growing in your garden next to it. The corn plant might go, okay, I'm going to send out root exudates to attract biology to bring me calcium. The pea plant may say that corn plant is sending out signals to have biology bring it calcium. I'm going to send out signals to have biology bring me magnesium, for instance. Through mycorrhizal fungi, they can feed each other. But you need the diverse array of plant species to cycle all these different nutrient compounds. But then also you have to have the healthy soil, the aggregation, the structure. You have to have the armor on the surface so that soil is healthy to have that diverse array of microbiology. And then you have to have not only bacteria, but you got to have protozoa and nematodes, fungi, and all these species to work in harmony. There's a team of scientists led by Dr. Stefan Van Vliet, who is at Utah State University, that's working on quantifying this and on doing the studies. And what they're finding is the more diverse the biology in that soil ecosystem, the wider the array of phytonutrients in these plants, in these vegetables, in these pastured proteins, in the case of meat, milk, eggs, etc. In a very simplistic term, a way, that's what it's about. It's about how do I, as a gardener or as a farmer, provide the home and habitat for the microbiology so that it can cycle the nutrients needed so I can grow the most nutrient-dense vegetable possible. And it's not rocket science. It goes back to the 6 principles driving the 4 ecosystem processes.
Now, with respect to animal and insect integration, we talked a bit about the importance of insects, and I want to maybe focus more on the livestock side of the equation. And perhaps to introduce this concept, I'm going to recount a story here locally that some of my listeners have heard me talk about before. But we have this ridge. It's a short ridge, about 1,000 feet up, that has nutrient poor soils. And it had supported for a long time a very high diversity of plants, which is counterintuitive for nutrient poor soils. But the reason for that is that the plants had evolved with these soils for so long. And ecologists had noticed that the plant diversity was declining, and then in the form of an important rare butterfly was disappearing because its plant was going away. And it had been traced to nitrogen deposition from the cars that drive by. So the nitrogen was making these nutrient poor soils more fertile, allowing for new competitors to move in. So that's shortcutting a few things. Now, one of these biologists noticed that there was this area where the plants were doing great. And it turned out that this was an area that was being grazed by cattle. And what he had determined was that the cattle grazing, which was being done with an appropriate density and frequency, they were being moved around a lot, and the timing of it allowed for some of these invasive plants to be reduced, basically chewed down by the cattle, and the native plants flourished. So that's my story. And despite this, and despite having clean visuals where there's a fence and grazing on one side, not grazing on the other side, and you see the diversity of flowers on the grazed side and invasive grasses taking over on the non-grazed side, despite these clear visuals and the data, there's still a lot of people that can't believe that grazing has a place. So that's partly what I'd like to push back against, because there's always nuance and context, as you spoke about. So I'm curious, first of all, what do you do on your property and what do you advocate for? And then I want to get into the discussion is how do you convince skeptics, perhaps after that?
Yeah, that's a great story, Michael. Thanks for sharing. And it's exactly the right story. The key there is we get back to the word context. And in our teaching, we use the phrase historical ecological context. Let's take California, for example. What's California's historical ecological context? Anyone who studies history in California, there were herds of elk in California, there was herds of bighorn, there was herds of deer being moved by predators. There was always these grazing animals, and that's not to mention all the other smaller animals like rabbits and grasshoppers, even as insects, etc. What happens when an animal grazes a plant? There's a relationship there that if you've watched a ruminant graze, they actually wrap their tongue around that plant and then they rip it off and they pull that plant and tear it. That signals the plant to start sloughing off root exudates to attract biology, to bring it nutrients. Hey, I was injured, I need to regrow. So it's taking more carbon out of the atmosphere, pumping that carbon into the soil to feed all these microorganisms so the plant can regrow. Also, what's happening when those animals graze? They're walking. They're trampling that material down, that plant material, onto the soil surface. What does that do? For one thing, it protects that soil from wind erosion, water erosion, but it also brings that plant material down in contact with the soil surface where the saprophytic fungi and all these microorganisms can start consuming it. The earthworms can start pulling it down into their burrows. That's what happens. What else happens? Obviously, the animals urinate and they defecate. That's a cycling of nutrients. We remove them from the landscape. That plant material remains upright. It goes to seed. Then it's not trampled onto the soil surface. It oxidizes. That carbon is released into the atmosphere, putting more carbon up into the atmosphere where it shouldn't be. We're not getting the urination, the defecation. The system collapses. If you look back in history, what we think of as the desert Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, etc., that was a lush grassland hundreds of years ago. It was a very lush grassland, but it desertified because of some improper grazing where animals are left too long. Every time an animal bites a plant, that plant sloughs those roots off. Like I said, you do that often enough, you're going to kill that plant. So it's not the cow, it's the how. It's the improper grazing that caused the desertification. That, and you look, there's several places where they have set up national parks and monuments, etc., where they've removed the animals from the landscape and the ecosystem has actually desertified. It's gotten worse because there's not the animal impact that's necessary. Animals are an extremely important part of the environment. On our ranch here in North Dakota, during the growing season, we move our animals every day. So they're on a particular, we call it a paddock, a small area for one day. Then they're moved to the next area where they grazed. We rest that for 12 to 15 months before those animals are brought back. What happens? Tremendous amount of growth, tremendous amount of carbon being cycled back into the soil, tremendous amount of diversity, tremendous insect population, both game and non-game species of wildlife flourish there. It's a win-win-win situation. Yet when we do come back and graze that particular paddock, we're going to graze it with a higher stock density, where we're trampling all that biomass that was produced for the previous 12 to 15 months, getting trampled onto the surface, a lot of urination, defecation, and you have this healthy, functioning ecosystem, just like occurred when the bison were grazing it hundreds of years ago.
It's really interesting to think about the process that you're describing. And I think it maybe plays into some oversimplification tendencies that we as people have, because tying back to something you said earlier, I think one of the arguments sometimes is that having livestock on the land will compact the soil and make it less healthy as a result. But you described just a little bit ago that really the soil health is driven by the biology in the soil itself. It's the compaction isn't the problem. And this maybe is where if you graze with too much intensity for too long of a duration, there's a negative impact there. But is this roughly in the right ballpark of what you practice?
That's exactly right. Compaction is a function of time. Let me give you this as an example. If you have a mule and your house is on top of a hill and you have to take that mule every day down that hill to bring water back to the house, if you make that trip once a day down that same path, you're going to have a trail by the end of a year, because it's 365 days up and down that trail. Meanwhile, if I take 365 mules down that trail, down that hillside once at one time, only once per year, you're not going to have any trail there, right? Because it was only a one-time event. You don't have that reoccurring trampling on the same part of the soil surface. Compaction is absolutely no issue. The only compaction is the compaction up between people's ears that they don't think that through.
It is. It's like you see a hoof print, for example, or a footprint or something, and that's the direct explanation. But as you've described, it's more complex than that. There's more happening in the soil.
The other thing we have to take into consideration is, are you building soil aggregates? Remember, think of it like marbles in a jar. That acts like a sponge. On our ranch now, scientists have documented that where I once only had 3 inches of aggregated soil, now in places I have over 4 feet deep of well-aggregated soil. Do you know what kind of a sponge that acts like? It doesn't matter if it's livestock or a tractor driving on it. It's not going to have a negative impact unless I do it repeatedly day after day.
The other thing I liked, you kicked off this answer talking about ecological context, and that's a big thing that's changed. I'm going to use the local example here in California, that not only has the animal community changed and the ability for animals to freely roam, but the plant community has changed dramatically as well. And the new dominant plant in a lot of our hills here in the San Francisco Bay Area is Italian ryegrass, which has a very different growth profile than what the native grasses would have had. And that context then means that, yeah, something needs to change to account for that as well. It's interesting to think about anyway.
Yeah, and also like species like Italian ryegrass are high nitrogen users. And soil is 1 part nitrogen to 11 parts of carbon. If we have a high nitrogen use plant and then we keep adding more nitrogen, we're throwing that balance off in our soil ecosystem. And if we grow more legumes, whether it be alfalfa or peas or clover, you're also going to throw off that carbon nitrogen balance, and you'll actually collapse that soil structure, thus allowing less water to infiltrate. Look at watch the news, knowing California like I do. I watched the news and saw all the flooding going on this spring. And all I could think about was, man, it's a shame they don't have well aggregated soil that could infiltrate that water, move it throughout the profile. They would have much less issues. And we see that over and over. Here I am in North Dakota, the eastern part of North Dakota. The Red River separates North Dakota from Minnesota. They have flooding issues every spring, and they're trying to figure out ways to divert the Red River around the cities. And I'm going, no, all you got to do is know how to build soil aggregates and don't destroy them, because the heavy amount of tillage compacts the soil, collapses the pore spaces between the aggregates. Thus, rainfall can't infiltrate. You have flooding issues. Meanwhile, our government spends mega amounts of money on infrastructure. I got a novel idea. Why don't they just grow plants and build soil aggregates?
It's funny that you bring this up, because I think, depending on how the timing goes, the episode that will air either immediately before or immediately after yours is about wetlands and how the Corps of Engineers, who's responsible for so many of the reservoirs that have been built over the years, they have now, at least in some respect, acknowledged that the best way to reduce flooding is by maintaining and restoring wetlands, which have these soils that you're talking about, these spongy, deep soils. So I'm really interested, as you went through this journey of learning about the ecological systems of regenerative agriculture and started to become a proponent leading up to your book, what kind of skepticism or maybe even cynicism did you see, and how have you been able to help convince people to move beyond that and actually give it a try?
Great question. Thank you for asking it. And for the last 25 plus years, I feel like my life has kind of been under a microscope, because so many people see what and hear about what we've done here, and many are oftentimes skeptical of it. So I don't spend a lot of time answering those skeptics except with an invitation. Come to my ranch. You can't sit 1,000 miles from my ranch and be skeptical if you haven't seen it. But come to my ranch and we will step onto the neighbor's property, and we'll stick a spade in the ground, and then we'll walk just a few feet away and stick a spade in my ground. And then you tell me that there's not something to what I'm saying. And I can honestly say this: I have never, ever, to my knowledge, had a single person come and take a look at my ranch, take a look at my neighbors, and leave not believing there's something to it. And I'll get 2,000 to 2,500 people through this ranch every summer. And you just seeing is believing. And no, I don't have all the scientific data. A team of scientists didn't come here and test my soils before I went down this path. But we've had many teams of scientists since then come, and they've tested the neighbor's soil and they've tested mine. And they will all tell you that it's true. That guy can grow soil. So
it starts with growing soil, it sounds like.
That's right. It's all about an aggregate. You just need to know how to build an aggregate.
In watching some of your presentations and hearing you speak in a few different forums, it sounds like that not only do you have some of this observational experience where you can show that your soil is healthier, it infiltrates water better, and all these things that we've talked about, but you're able to do it profitably as well. And my impression is that with your practice, you're able to take the edges off of these boom bust cycles, maybe that other farmers encounter. So how influential has that aspect of your practice been to those who maybe are on the fence about adopting regenerative practice?
Since my book came out, my wife and I have retired from ranching. Our son now owns and operates the ranch. And along with my partners, we've formed a regenerative consulting company called Understanding Ag. And Understanding Ag started in 2017. And our whole desire was to educate. My partners and I wanted to educate others because we understand that education is the missing link. farmers and ranchers cannot implement what they do not know, and gardeners. They need to understand the principles and the processes. And so now we're actively consulting on over 33 million acres across North America, England, Ireland, moving into Africa now. I would have never envisioned that there would be the interest that there is. We are working for many of the major brands and corporations around the world, helping to move their supply chains down the regenerative path. Last year, we launched another company called Regenerative, and Regenerative is a certification company where it will help supply chains verify that the products that they're purchasing and selling are truly helping move the environment into a better place down this regenerative path. And you're just starting to see now, we were approved by Whole Foods, and there is certified Regenerative products starting to show up on store shelves now. And that's exciting because we were seeing a lot of greenwashing taking place. There was a lot of companies that were saying, oh, we're helping to regenerate 1 million acres or 30 million acres. My partners and I, who have been in this our adult lives, are saying, no, that's not really helping the ecosystem. So we decided it's time to take a stand and call them out, so to speak, and say, okay, here's the protocol. Are you truly purchasing products from farmers, ranchers that are implementing the principles to drive the processes? And we document that. We document it through one of the most comprehensive, stringent testing protocols that is out there. And we are really feel blessed and fortunate that it is catching on, and it is giving consumers the confidence knowing that if they purchase these products, they're really spending their purchasing dollar in a way that is making meaningful change to our ecosystems.
So if someone were to go to a Whole Foods, would they actually see a label now that certified regenerative or something like that?
It's dependent on which Whole Foods and where, but it's coming out. We're ramping up quickly. Like I said, we've only been in business 1 year, but it is amazing. We have a number of major companies that are moving their supply chain down this path. And there is some certified Regenerative products on shelves now.
Great. And that's something that I'll promise to listeners I have a newsletter I send out periodically. I'll make sure to stay up to date with how that progresses so that we can make more informed purchase choices. And maybe it also begs the question of how do you compare a Regenerative certification to an organic certification?
I tell people that we are in no way competing. Our goal is to inform. We want to inform the consumer and let them decide. But I'm not going to say anything negative about any of the other certifications. I'm just going to say that the Regenerative certification is by far the most comprehensive certification available.
So continuing and thinking about these different certifications that people could have, why are you not certified organic then?
Yes, good question. And it would be very easy for my ranch to be organic certified. But I tell people, I want to take it way beyond that. I want to prove to the consumers that Brown's Ranch is doing what's best, not only for producing nutrient-dense food, but that is free of these synthetic inputs, chemicals. But I want to do it in a way that is truly advancing the health of the ecosystem. I am certified Regenerative because I want to give consumers the confidence that when they buy a product from Brown's Ranch, it's not only healthy for them, it's not only nutrient dense, but we're also helping to take massive amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soils. Where also producing clean water. Also, any rain that falls on our ranch is infiltrating into the soil, not running off and eroding topsoil. See, it's not so much about one or the other. It's about how can I give that consumer the most confidence I can that they're using their purchasing dollar to make meaningful change.
As you point out, consumers can make these choices and move the market over time. I'm curious to talk a little bit more about broader adoption of regenerative practices. And so one is we can start looking for these labels, obviously. How do prices tend to compare for Regenified certified food compared to, say, an organic food or traditionally grown?
Yes, and that's a fair question. And I tell people Gabe Brown is a capitalist. Okay. I went from being $1.5 million in debt to being debt free. And I have this ranch and I'm not looking for more money. I'm doing okay. So, how did I do that? I didn't do it by giving away my products, but it is supply and demand. Now, the beautiful thing about it is, as I work in harmony and synchrony with nature, I become more of a least cost producer. So I could sell my products in the conventional market and I would make more money than my neighbors do because it costs me less to produce them. However, because of the nutrient density of our products, because of what we're doing for the environment, consumers are willing to pay more for my products. Now, I'm not going to turn that money down. And so right now it's supply and demand. But make no mistake about it, our goal is that as more and more producers, farmers, ranchers, gardeners adopt these practices, the prices will come down. And we really believe that in the near future, consumers will be able to buy fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins that are higher in nutrient density at a lower price point than they're paying today.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into some of the other aspects of how you achieve this. For example, the flexibility that's inherent to your practice, where if nature throws you a curveball with respect to weather, you may choose to plant a different crop that year, whatever the case might be. So I'm thinking about a lot of people I know have expressed a desire to at some point maybe own an acreage, retire on it, create a little homestead of their own with a regenerative practice. And I don't know, there may be some farmers that listen to this podcast. I don't know. If you are a farmer out there, please let me know. I'd be curious to learn of that. But how can people start down this road? What would you recommend they do first? Where do they go look? What do they do?
Oh, another good question. And the first thing they need to do is educate themselves. You mentioned Dr. Elaine Ingham. She has a wealth of information out there. Our nonprofit Soil Health Academy is an educational arm that we have. And we have a lot of information on that website about soils and ecosystems and how they function. On our Understanding Ag website, we have free resources. We put out a newsletter every week. We have webinars that are free. We list case studies, all free information for people to come and look at. We also have a reading list on there that lists some really good books that talk about soil ecosystems and how soils function. You have to become a lifelong learner, and you really need to make a concerted effort to understand. I grew up, my father rototilled the garden every spring, and I thought that was the right thing to do until I learned that it's actually the worst thing we can do to produce nutrient-dense food because we're destroying the home for the biology, the very biology that bring those nutrients to the plants. So you have to educate yourself. That's where it starts.
And I'll make sure to link to many of the resources, all the resources that you mentioned in the show notes to hopefully make it a little bit easier for people. And of course, you have a book that was released, I think, in 2018, Dirt to Soil. Is that correct?
That is correct. Still number one selling book on Amazon in soil science after going 5.5 years. rather amazed me that it's been so popular.
I was amazed. I was looking at it on Amazon the other day, and the reviews that you have, it was in the thousands. I don't remember exactly how many, but there were none lower than 3 stars. And to see that, it was pretty phenomenal.
I'm blessed. It's now been published in 11 different languages. And I was just asked to tell my story. I had no intention of writing a book, but I did. And I've been really humbled by how well received it is. And my business partners and I at Understanding Ag, we hope to have our new book out this coming fall. And I'd put in a plug also. There's going to be a movie that's debuting at Tribeca here in June called Common Ground. And that movie is all about regeneration and the importance for society to focus on regeneration. We have a saying at Understanding Ag, common ground for common good. We really believe that as a society, humans can agree on 85% plus of the issues that are out there. Why then do we spend all our time arguing about the 15%? Let's come together as a society. We all want to take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back in the soil cycle. We all want clean water. We all want an adequate supply of water. We all want nutrient-dense foods. Why can't we come together and find common ground for common good?
The wheels are spinning in my head based on what you just said. Because when I look at some of the climate arguments, starting with that common ground standpoint of, hey, we want to have more nutrient-dense foods and stronger soils, so it's easier to grow food. Let's start there. Let's have a project to help make that happen, and everybody wins. It seems so common sense, as you said.
I got asked to testify last year in front of Congress, the Agriculture Committee. They were having a hearing on agriculture's role in climate change. And I was the only farmer asked to testify. I can't understand how they could have a hearing on agriculture in the Agriculture Committee and only invite one farmer. But I sat there listening, and one side of the aisle said it's all climate change, climate change. We need to fight climate change. The other side of the aisle was saying, no, we need to increase farm ranch profitability. We got to revitalize rural communities. We need more money in agriculture. And Gabe sitting in the middle going, you fools. You all want the same thing. Why can't you come together? I spend the majority of part of my life now in front of this laptop talking to boards of directors, heads of sustainability, CEOs of large companies, organizations. And the thing I do is I try and find where's their pain point? Where's their interest point? Are they interested in climate change? That's what I'm going to talk to them about. Are they interested in farm profitability? I'm going to talk to them about that. But in the end, it all comes back to regenerative agriculture. For you see, agriculture, yes, it was part of the problem. But regenerative agriculture can be a major part of the solution for many of these issues facing society. So why can't we come together, find common ground for common good?
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the wrap-up questions that I was intending to ask, and you've bundled several of them together here. So that's great. Now, you mentioned you have an upcoming book, and what's the focus of that book going to be?
That book will be focused like the movie Common Ground. It'll be the focus of it. It'll be how we have to come together as a society and realize that there needs to be major wholesale change in all of agriculture for the betterment of all.
Do you have any other projects upcoming that you'd like to highlight?
There's a number of them. Probably one of them that's key to me is one I just mentioned briefly, the work that Dr. Van Vliet, Dr. Provenza, and Dr. Kronberg are doing with the phytonutrient density in foods as it relates to soils. I think that's just groundbreaking. We're going to bring in members of the medical community. We really need to get back to where food is used as preventative medicine. Our health is directly related to the health of our gut microbiome, which is directly related to the nutrient density of these phytonutrient compounds of the food we eat, which is directly related to the health of the soil. And so why can't we focus on the whole change? Soil health, plant health, animal health, human health.
Gabe, thank you so much for all the time that you've spent with us here today. It's really been enlightening, and I look forward to learning more. You mentioned a lot of resources, and as I said, I'll include those in the show notes. But just to make sure I'm not missing anything, what would be the best places for people to stay on top of the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, thank you, Michael. It's been a real pleasure being with you today. So I would ask them to check out our understandingag.com website or soilhealthacademy.org. And then the third one is Regenerative.
Sounds good. And do you have any social media presence?
Yes, we do. You can just go ahead and check out Understanding Ag. And I got to be honest with you, I receive 200 to 400 emails and phone calls a day. So I do not take part in social media because there's no way I could keep up. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time today to do it. I imagine things are getting busy right now. It's mid-May. Are you in the frost-free time yet up in Bismarck?
We do have the garden planted and we are out seeding. So just beginning the growing season here in North Dakota.
All right. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Michael.
Before wrapping up, thank you to Michelle Balderston for editing help this week. Thank you to Jess Hassenplau for production assistance. Thank you to the Patreon patrons for your continued support, and everyone who has left ratings and reviews of the podcast. Thanks for sticking through the entire episode. If you made it this far, I hope that it means that you enjoyed it. If so, please spread the word and share this episode with 3 friends or groups that you think would enjoy it too. As for today's episode, let me know. Did I miss anything? Was there a topic I should have covered? Let me know at podcast@jumpstartnature.com or DM me on any of my social accounts. I'll do my best to answer your questions. You can find me at Nature's Archive, one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also share photography, nature stories, and much more on those accounts, so you can follow just to stay in touch, too. And despite being called crazy by numerous friends and colleagues, last year I left my tech career behind to start Jumpstart Nature, which Nature's Archive is now part of. For the sake of myself, my family, and the planet, I need to make this work. So please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/jumpstartnature. I offer some exclusive content and perks, and you can start donations as low as $4 a month. Lastly, please also check out our latest creation. It's the Jumpstart Nature podcast. We just completed our pilot season, where each episode reveals an unseen, surprising, or misunderstood nature topic with the help of experts and our host, Griff Griffith. It's entertaining and inspiring, and even reached number 3 on the Apple Nature podcast charts. There's much more on our roadmap, but we need your support, so check out jumpstartnature.com for more details. Thank you.